What if your punishment wasn't the cell, but the food? Inside Mississippi's Parchman Prison, inmates say the meals themselves became torture. Spoiled meat, moldy bread, and rats running through the kitchen. The Department of Justice called it a violation of human rights. A system designed to starve the spirit, not just the body. Before we uncover the shocking truth behind America's most infamous prison kitchens, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because what you're about to see is one of the darkest stories ever hidden behind bars. When federal investigators entered Mississippi State Penitentiary, better known as Parchman Farm, they didn't just find a crumbling prison. They found a humanitarian crisis disguised as a correctional facility. The year was 2020, and reports of neglect, violence, and starvation had forced the U.S. Department of Justice (DOJ) to open a civil rights investigation under the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. But what they uncovered inside Parchman's kitchens went far beyond broken pipes and leaking roofs. It revealed a system that weaponized hunger. Inspectors described kitchens filled with rotting vegetables, spoiled milk, and meat crawling with maggots. Photos taken during the investigation showed trays of food unfit for human consumption, sometimes served cold, sometimes hours or even days after being prepared. Inmates reported that they would often skip meals entirely rather than risk food poisoning. Those with family support begged relatives to send care packages just to survive. Others bartered cigarettes for instant noodles, knowing that one bad meal could leave them bedridden for days. According to DOJ records, the prison's food storage rooms were infested with cockroaches and rodents. Bags of rice and flour were chewed open, and inspectors noted visible contamination by animal waste. One inmate later told investigators, "The rats ate better than we did." For years, Parchman Prison had been the subject of lawsuits, documentaries, and even protests. But the conditions revealed in the kitchen area struck a deeper chord. This wasn't just about violence or overcrowding. This was about basic human survival, about how a system meant to correct had instead starved people into silence. The DOJ's findings were damning. Their official statement read, "The Mississippi Department of Corrections fails to provide adequate nutrition and sanitation, resulting in conditions that pose an ongoing risk to the health and safety of incarcerated persons." But how did things get this bad? The answer lies in a toxic mix of budget cuts, privatization, and neglect. A system that values profit over people. For decades, Mississippi outsourced its prison food services to the lowest bidders, often private corporations promising to save taxpayer money. In reality, these contracts encouraged corner-cutting, undercooked meals, and staff shortages. One former kitchen worker admitted that they sometimes reused trays from previous meals without washing them, because we didn't have enough soap. By 2019, the state was spending less than $1.60 per inmate per day on food, one of the lowest rates in the nation. Compare that to the $4 to $6 average in many northern states, and the results were predictable: malnutrition, sickness, and despair. Medical logs from Parchman's infirmary show a sharp increase in reports of stomach infections, food poisoning, and weight loss. Some inmates lost 20 to 30 pounds within months. One man, interviewed by the Clarion Ledger, said that when he complained about the food, he was told, "You're lucky you're eating it all." The situation grew worse during the COVID-19 pandemic, when staff shortages crippled kitchen operations. Inmates reported being served cold cereal for every meal, sometimes without milk. Others received slices of bread spread with ketchup as lunch. For a population already vulnerable to disease, hunger became yet another form of punishment. Outside Parchman, families began to protest. Mothers, sisters, and wives gathered outside the prison gates holding handmade signs that read, "Human beings deserve food." Their cries echoed through the Mississippi Delta, a place where poverty and race have always shaped the story of incarceration. Many of Parchman's inmates are black men serving long sentences, a painful reminder of how history repeats itself on the same soil where enslaved people once worked the fields. The prison's nickname, Parchman Farm, is no coincidence. Built in 1901, it was modeled after a slave plantation, where inmates were forced to labor in cotton fields under armed supervision. Now, more than a century later, the same institution stands accused of violating the same fundamental right, the right to live with dignity. The DOJ's report concluded that Parchman's food system endangered lives and perpetuated inhumane treatment. It cited evidence of inmates suffering from severe malnutrition, unsanitary meal preparation, and deliberate neglect. Despite the findings, meaningful reforms came slowly. State officials promised improvements, but funding remained thin and oversight weaker still. Inside the prison, nothing seemed to change. The smell of rancid grease lingered in the air, and inmates still lined up 3 times a day for trays they could barely stomach. For many, hunger became routine, not because they had no food but because the food itself was punishment. In one of the most haunting testimonies collected by investigators, an inmate whispered, "You start to lose your mind when you're hungry every day. After a while, you forget what real food even tastes like." The hunger inside Parchman wasn't just physical, it was psychological. It stripped men of their will, dignity, and hope. And it raised a terrifying question. If this is how America treats the forgotten, what does that say about justice itself? Behind every tray of spoiled food at Parchman Prison lies a paper trail: invoices, contracts, and corporate promises. To understand why inmates went hungry, you have to follow the money. What the Department of Justice found wasn't simply neglect, it was profit-driven punishment, a machine where human suffering became a business expense. In the early 2000s, Mississippi joined dozens of states in privatizing prison services, from healthcare to food. The idea was sold as cost efficiency. Companies like Trinity Services Group and Aramark Correctional Services offered to handle prison meals for far less than it cost the state. The promise? Lower taxes, same quality. The reality? Cheaper food, fewer staff, and growing hunger. For every inmate meal served, the state paid the company a fixed rate, often less than $2 per day per inmate. The lower the company's expenses, the higher their profit margin. And that's where the incentives turned deadly. Investigators later found that in some prisons, suppliers routinely replaced meat with soy-based substitutes without disclosure. Vegetables arrived frozen, months past expiration. Bread shipments molded in transit because the trucks weren't refrigerated. Former employees described working with ingredients fit for dog food. But when they complained, supervisors told them to make it work, because throwing away food would hurt the numbers. At Parchman, this business model met a prison already on life support. The kitchen staff was undertrained and overworked. Refrigerators broke down and were left unrepaired for weeks. A leaking roof dripped onto storage shelves where flour, rice, and sugar were kept, all while auditors signed off the facility as functional. The men eating those meals had no idea that behind each spoonful of watery beans was a contract clause rewarding cost containment. The system became self-reinforcing. Fewer funds meant cheaper ingredients. Cheaper ingredients meant more complaints. More complaints led to punishments, not for the companies but for the inmates who spoke out. Several prisoners who reported the spoiled food were allegedly moved to solitary confinement, labeled as troublemakers. One man wrote in a letter smuggled to a journalist, "They punish you for being hungry. If you say something, you don't eat for days." By 2021, federal investigators discovered that some Mississippi prisons were ordering bulk meals from a central facility, where food was prepared in massive industrial vats and distributed across the state. There was no guarantee the food was kept at safe temperatures during transport. Sometimes inmates received trays of congealed gravy, rice hardened into bricks, or gray-colored meat of unknown origin. It wasn't unusual to find insects mixed in. The Department of Justice confirmed that these meals violated national sanitation standards and basic nutritional guidelines. In one inspection, the entire kitchen had to be shut down temporarily due to imminent health hazards. But even as reports grew, the corporations kept their contracts. Why? Because in Mississippi and across the U.S., private prison contractors wield enormous political influence. They donate to campaigns, sponsor correctional conferences, and maintain powerful lobbying arms that push cost-cutting reforms. And while prisons save pennies, these companies make millions. Trinity Services Group, for example, operates in more than 40 states. In 2022 alone, it generated hundreds of millions in revenue. Their public slogan? Nourishing those in our care. Yet in states like Michigan, Florida, and Mississippi, investigative journalists uncovered patterns of spoiled food, corruption, and retaliation. Employees accused the company of falsifying temperature logs and underreporting portion sizes to save costs. In one internal audit, the company was found to have substituted menu items more than 300 times in a single month, violating its contract. But the state rarely penalized them, because to do so would mean admitting failure. In this system, accountability disappears as easily as a meal tray in the trash. The consequences weren't abstract. They were human. Inmates developed nutrient deficiencies so severe that some lost hair or teeth. Others, especially diabetics, suffered dangerous blood sugar crashes because their meals lacked protein or balance. And when the sick went to the infirmary, they often found the same companies supplying the medical food, perpetuating the cycle of malnutrition. families tried to fill the gap. Care packages became lifelines, boxes of ramen, canned tuna, peanut butter. But not every inmate had outside help. For those without family, starvation wasn't occasional, it was institutionalized. The DOJ Civil Rights Division noted that food deprivation and unsanitary preparation practices at Parchman created conditions of psychological torment. Hunger turned men against each other. In the dorms, inmates fought over commissary noodles. In one reported case, a man was stabbed over a packet of instant coffee. The cruelty was systematic, but invisible to the public, until 2020, when viral photos surfaced online showing trays of brown mush and gray meat marked Parchman Penitentiary. The outrage sparked brief media coverage, but it faded quickly. America, after all, has grown numb to prison suffering. Still, for the men inside, each meal was a reminder of how little their lives were worth. They called it slow punishment, the kind that doesn't kill instantly but wears you down piece by piece. As one inmate wrote, "They're not starving us to death. They're starving us to forget we're human." What makes this story even darker is how deeply the economics of prison food are tied to mass incarceration itself. The more people locked up, the more contracts to sign, the more meals to serve, and the more profit to earn. Hunger, in this sense, is not a failure of the system, it is part of the design. And nowhere is that more evident than in Mississippi's budget sheets, where food costs shrink each year while private contractors report growing revenue. It's a quiet economy of despair, measured not in dollars but in empty stomachs. By the time the federal investigators returned to Parchman Prison in mid-2021, hunger had already changed the rhythm of daily life. The Chow Hall, once the noisy heart of the penitentiary, had become a place of silent endurance, a ritual of survival where every bite was taken with suspicion. Men shuffled through the line, eyes down, trays clutched like shields. The smell of boiled cabbage and rancid grease filled the air. Grease stains covered the concrete floors, and flies circled overhead in lazy spirals. Inmates learned to scan their food quickly, pick out the bones, scrape away mold, and hope that whatever was left wouldn't make them sick. In the back corner, a man everyone called Red whispered, "Don't eat the eggs, bro, green spots again." It wasn't paranoia, it was survival instinct. They had seen too many men doubled over after breakfast, too many faces pale from vomiting. One kitchen worker later admitted that the eggs were powdered mix left sitting open for weeks, stirred into lukewarm water each morning. A silent war begins. The revolt didn't start with violence. It started with refusal. A handful of inmates in Unit 30B, one of the oldest blocks in Parchman, decided they would no longer eat the prison food. They saved their commissary packs, shared instant noodles, and spread the word quietly. Don't touch the chow until they fix it. At first, officers laughed. They'd seen hunger strikes before. Most ended in a few days when the body's natural desperation overpowered protest. But this one was different. The strikers kept going, 4 days then a week. Other units began to join. The Chow Hall emptied and kitchen workers were forced to throw out untouched trays. The Mississippi Department of Corrections tried to downplay it. Official reports referred to it as temporary meal refusal. But inside, tension simmered. Prison officials cut commissary access, hoping to break the strike. Still, the inmates persisted. For them, eating spoiled food was worse than going hungry. By the second week, the protests spread across multiple units. Some men used contraband phones to record short clips, bowls of watery beans, bread spotted with black mold, and a rat scurrying across the serving counter. The footage leaked online, igniting outrage. Civil rights activists and local journalists began tagging the Department of Justice and Governor Tate Reeves, demanding answers. The hashtags #FeedParchman and #StarvingForJustice trended briefly on Twitter. Inside the kitchen. While the public debated, the men assigned to kitchen duty saw everything up close. One of them, known in records as inmate T14, later wrote a detailed account that was smuggled out through a pastor. The meat comes in boxes marked, "Not for human consumption." They cut off the labels before serving. Sometimes they mix spoiled rice with fresh rice so it doesn't smell. "We clean pots with laundry powder because there's no dish soap left." He claimed that broken refrigerators were never replaced because it's cheaper to let the food rot than fix the unit. On hot Mississippi days, milk turned sour within hours. Some inmates used that milk to ferment alcohol just to escape their hunger. But even among those working in the kitchen, there was a strange loyalty. They fed the system that punished them, yet they also risked punishment to sneak out food for others. "We hid peanut butter under our shirts," one former inmate confessed. "If the guards caught you, that's a week in the hole." The retaliation. When the protest gained media attention, retaliation came swiftly. Guards stormed the cells of known organizers in the middle of the night, confiscating notes and phones. Some men were transferred to solitary confinement, a windowless concrete box barely large enough to lie down in. In solitary, the hunger deepened. Meals were slid through a small metal slot, cold sandwiches, half-frozen fruit, sometimes nothing but a slice of bread. The message was clear: speak out and we'll make sure you starve alone. Still, their defiance left a mark. Within weeks, federal monitors arrived again. Photos from their visit showed officers hastily repainting walls and cleaning kitchens, a performance of reform. But one inspector wrote privately in his notes, "These improvements are cosmetic. The underlying neglect remains systemic." The taste of hope. Months later, the DOJ's Civil Rights Division released a preliminary report confirming that Mississippi's prison food operations pose significant health and safety risks. That phrase, dry, bureaucratic, was the closest thing to validation the inmates had ever received. For the men of Unit 30B, it was victory enough. They started eating again not because the food improved but because they had made the world look their way, if only for a moment. Some changes did follow. A new contractor hired, new equipment promised, nutritional oversight committees announced. But inside Parchman, most believed it was just another cycle. "They clean it up when the cameras come," Red muttered one night. "Then it goes right back." In the Chow Hall, laughter slowly returned. A few men joked about opening a cooking show, Parchman Kitchen, "Don't die tonight." Humor became resistance. It was how they survived, through laughter, solidarity, and the stubborn belief that they still mattered. By the end of 2022, hunger had etched itself into every memory of Parchman's men. Some left prison with permanent stomach damage. Others carried invisible scars, distrust, bitterness, and the haunting smell of spoiled food. But their rebellion, small as it seemed, exposed a truth that America could no longer ignore. You can't reform what you refuse to see. Food is supposed to sustain life, not break it. And at Parchman, it became the weapon of a system too broken to feed its own captives. The storm that began inside Parchman's Chow Hall didn't end with the hunger strike. It spread through courtrooms, newsrooms, and the highest levels of state government. For years, Mississippi had managed to bury complaints under bureaucratic language. But by 2022, the voices of those who lived through the hunger could no longer be silenced. The evidence was overwhelming, and some of it came from inside the system itself. The whistleblower. Her name was Angela Porter, a former food service manager with the Mississippi Department of Corrections. For nearly 8 years, she worked in the kitchens of Parchman and 2 other state prisons. When she finally spoke to investigators, her testimony peeled away the final layer of secrecy. "We were told to serve food that I wouldn't feed my dog," she said. "They'd reheat leftovers from the day before, or scrape food from one tray to another to make it look full. If we complained, we were told the budget didn't allow for better." Angela produced internal memos showing how maintenance requests for broken freezers were ignored for months, and how staff shortages led to unsupervised inmates handling spoiled meat. She also revealed that temperature logs were falsified daily to make inspections pass, a practice she described as routine across multiple facilities. Her testimony didn't just implicate low-level employees. It pointed directly to supervisors and contractors who knowingly signed off on these conditions while collecting performance bonuses for efficiency. The lawsuit. By mid-2022, a federal class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of several Parchman inmates, citing violations of the 8th Amendment and federal health standards. The case, Hall v. Mississippi Department of Corrections, exposed a trail of systemic neglect. In court filings, lawyers presented photos of trays containing raw chicken, rotten fruit, and discolored water labeled as soup. One plaintiff testified that he was hospitalized 3 times for food poisoning, once after eating meat later identified as expired catfish from an unlicensed supplier. Emails uncovered during discovery showed a chilling reality. One state administrator wrote, "If we raise food spending, we'll blow the annual budget. Tell them to make do with current supplies." Another message from a contractor executive read, "Don't waste product. Reuse wherever possible." Those 6 words, reuse wherever possible, became the centerpiece of the trial, symbolizing the state's moral decay. The verdict of the people. The courtroom battle drew national attention. Documentaries, editorials, and advocacy groups flooded the conversation. Civil rights organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center and ACLU joined in, calling Parchman a modern-day plantation. Public pressure mounted, and Mississippi officials could no longer hide behind budget excuses. In late 2023, the Department of Justice released its final report, confirming what inmates had been saying all along. Parchman's food operations demonstrate deliberate indifference to human life and dignity. The report demanded immediate corrective action, including independent food audits, new sanitation standards, and oversight by external monitors. The DOJ called the situation a humanitarian failure. For once, those words, humanitarian failure, appeared in the same sentence as United States of America. The ruling didn't erase the pain, but it forced the system to look in the mirror. Angela Porter's courage inspired other whistleblowers to come forward from prisons across the South. Investigations opened in Louisiana, Alabama, and Georgia, revealing eerily similar conditions. Parchman was no longer an exception, it was a warning. The aftermath. In 2024, Mississippi's new corrections commissioner promised sweeping reforms. Kitchens were renovated, a new contractor was hired, and training programs were introduced. But for many inside, the trust was gone. As one inmate wrote in a letter published by the Marshall Project, "You can fix a kitchen, but you can't fix the years of hunger in a man's heart." The reforms looked good on paper, but the scars ran deeper. The men who survived Parchman's starvation years carried both physical and emotional wounds. Their health compromised, their faith in justice shattered. Yet they also carried something else. Proof that even the most voiceless can be heard. In a country where punishment is often mistaken for justice, their suffering became a mirror reflecting a darker truth. That dignity, not cruelty, is the real measure of civilization. And in the silence of their cells, they held on to one quiet victory. The world finally knew what they ate, what they endured, and what they refused to accept. Change in Parchman didn't come overnight. It rarely does in a system built to forget. But sometimes change begins in whispers. The hunger strike had shaken the walls, the lawsuit had exposed the truth, and the nation had finally looked inward. What came next was a quiet reckoning, a slow, painful attempt to rebuild what decades of neglect had destroyed. The new director. In early 2024, the Mississippi Department of Corrections appointed a new commissioner, Marcus Ellery, a former Marine-turned-reform advocate. He stepped into the role amid mounting pressure from federal monitors and public outrage. Ellery's first visit to Parchman was captured by local news cameras. As he toured the kitchen, now freshly painted, with gleaming steel counters and new refrigeration units, he said only 5 words. "This is where we begin." Behind him, inmates stood watching, skeptical but curious. They had heard those words before, promises of reform that dissolved like steam off boiling rice. But Ellery's approach felt different. He didn't talk about cost savings or efficiency, he talked about dignity. He ordered new contracts with transparent audits, banned reused food items, and required monthly nutritional testing. He even ate lunch with inmates on his second visit, sitting at a metal table and trying the same beans and bread they were served. "It's edible," he admitted, "but it's not human." Inside the kitchen, a second chance. For some inmates, the reforms brought something unexpected: purpose. Under a new vocational program, select prisoners were trained and certified in food safety and culinary arts. They learned to cook, clean, and manage inventory under supervision from civilian instructors. For the first time, they weren't just consuming food, they were creating it. One of them, known as Andre "Smoke" Watson, had once been part of the hunger strike. He told a reporter for the Jackson Free Press, "When you're starving, you stop caring. When you cook for others, you start feeling human again." Andre's kitchen became a symbol of quiet resistance. Men in white aprons stirring pots, measuring spices, tasting the meals before serving. They no longer saw trays as punishment, but as proof that someone, somewhere, was trying. Still, challenges persisted. Budget fights in the state legislature threatened to derail progress. Old contractors lobbied for their return, claiming they could cut costs again. But this time the public watched closely. After the scandal, eyes that once looked away now demanded transparency. The hunger at Parchman had forced Mississippi, and the nation, to confront the uncomfortable truth that cheap food comes at a human cost. The return of the watchdogs. Independent auditors, journalists, and activists continued to monitor Parchman. In one inspection they found measurable improvements. No rodent infestations, no expired ingredients, and visible sanitation upgrades. Still, not everything was fixed. Inmates reported occasional shortages and bland, repetitive meals. But the days of maggot-infested trays were gone. A follow-up DOJ report in 2025 acknowledged substantial progress, while warning that systemic oversight remains necessary. One line stood out. Reform is not an event. It is endurance. Those words echoed through every block of Parchman. The legacy of hunger. For those who lived through the starvation years, the memories remained raw. Many suffered lifelong health complications: ulcers, malnutrition, chronic fatigue. Some turned their pain into activism after release, speaking at universities and human rights panels. One former inmate, James "Slim" Carter, told a crowd at Ole Miss, "They fed us like animals, but we came out human. That's the power of surviving hunger. It teaches you what freedom really means." Carter later founded a nonprofit called Meal of Mercy, sending food packages to inmates across Mississippi. He raised money through community drives, saying, "If the state won't feed them right, we will." Across the country, documentaries, podcasts, and op-eds reignited public debate about prison nutrition, mass incarceration, and privatization. The movement was growing. From California to Florida, activists invoked one name, Parchman, as a symbol of both suffering and awakening. A new chapter of accountability. By late 2025, several other states introduced legislation mandating nutritional standards and public reporting for all prison meals. Mississippi, under pressure, passed the Inmate Dignity Food Act, requiring independent inspections and quarterly transparency reports. For the first time, prisons were being judged not just by their security measures, but by the quality of their food. The irony wasn't lost on those who had suffered. It had taken starvation to remind the nation that food, the most basic human need, was not a privilege but a right. Parchman's story became a warning to every institution built on neglect. Starve a man's body, and you might silence him for a moment. Starve his dignity and you awaken a movement. In the end, justice isn't found in the courtroom or the headlines. It's found in the simple act of being fed, being seen, being treated as human. Parchman taught America that hunger doesn't just happen from empty plates. It happens when compassion runs out.